Repairing a 5-inch gauge Modelworks Pannier tank. Part 4. Fitting 1-inch long 21 gauge compression springs to the spring hangers and checking the calibration of the suspension to make sure that it is working correctly. First of all though, I have to remove the springs that I previously fitted along with the silicone rubber inserts. It took a lot less time to remove these springs than it did to fit them. I couldn't live with leaving these as I fitted them because they are far too strong for this engine. This sort of worked but left the engine without any perceivable suspension. And if you watch the previous episode you will notice that when I ran the engine it sounded very hard and very unpleasant. When I think about it, in the past I have had girlfriends like that, but luckily not so many. You will be pleased to know that I am not going to show the removal of every one of these springs. In fact, that is enough. After a while, all 12 of the springs ended up in the plastic bag that they came in. Now I have a good collection of 5/16 of an inch diameter 18 gauge axle box springs. Here are the new ones, 3.5 inch gauge loco axle box springs, 7/32 of an inch outside diameter, 1 inch long and 21 gauge, which should allow a bit more movement. Here I'm comparing the springs with the originals. The original ones are on the left, and as you can see, they have a larger inside diameter and they're not so good really. Here's another comparison. The old spring is on the right hand side. As you can see, it's shorter and its internal diameter is much bigger than the new one on the left, which is 1/8 of an inch inside diameter. Here's a shot of all 12 new springs. When I fit these, they are not going to require silicone rubber tubing. One problem that I found with this locomotive, with the exception of the rear axle, is there isn't much play on the axle boxes in either the up and down movement or the side to side. The axle boxes on the other wheels are a bit tighter. I'm using the same principles I showed in the previous episode, a piece of silicone rubber tubing in the socket to hold the shallow nuts at the end. Fitting the previous springs took 2.5 hours and was very difficult to do because of the strength of the springs. Fitting all these springs was very easy, and the time taken to fit them was less than an hour. And I can also tighten the nuts on the spring hangers to apply some travel limitation to the springs. I don't know why these holes in the keeper plates are so big. Really, they just need to be clearance size for 1/8 of an inch in diameter, which is the approximate size of the spring hangers. Here I'm demonstrating the amount of play on the rear axle. It moves up and down very smoothly in the horn blocks and there is some tilt present. The crank axle is a bit stiffer. It shouldn't be, but it is, and there isn't much tilt allowed for on the crank axle, but there should be really. This is how the engine was made. At this stage I'm not in any hurry to do a complete rebuild on this machine. The brief is to stop it locking up and make it go. In no time at all I'm fitting the keeper plates to the springs on the front axle. The feel of this in the horn blocks is not as tight as on the crank axle, but not as slack as in the rear axle. It is vital that none of the axle boxes stick in the horn blocks at any part of their travel. All axle boxes need to apply smooth downward pressure to every axle. Have a look at the mark on this wheel. Because this engine has been locking up, someone's dragged it across a concrete floor by the look of it. I once had a 5-inch gauge Manor class locomotive, which had been dragged along concrete floors many times because the wheels didn't go round until most of the flange at the same point on each axle had gone. Luckily I got away with this because the depth of the tread was very overscale, so I just reduced that down to a scale size and everything was fine. I'm going to run the engine now for a prolonged period, so I think it's a good idea to inject quite a lot of oil through this pipe into the steam chest. Very shortly I will be making a pipe that goes from here to the lubricator in the cab. But there's no point doing that just yet until the locomotive is permanently sat on its wheels, as the steam oil will run out of the tank in the cab. Here I'm making some further adjustments to the spring hangers, tightening the nuts. This is a quick test. I'm putting downward pressure on the engine and it feels much better. Now at least it has some kind of suspension. Time now to put the engine back on the rolling road, starting with the centre axle, then the front, then the rear. Time now to open the air valve to about 50 pounds per square inch and see what happens. Now I'm about to move the locomotive around to simulate it riding down a bumpy track. Press down on the back, that's okay. I press down on the front and that's okay. The engine is running much more smoothly, nowhere near as lumpy as it did with the springs that I fitted in the last episode, and the good news is it's not locking up at all. I do notice a bit of a problem with one of the rear wheels, and you see around the axle some oil bubbles. This means that the axle is not tight in the wheel. But having said that, it doesn't appear to be moving much, so I'm going to leave that for the time being. The main thing is the engine has flexible suspension. Here, when I press down on the front of the engine and release it, it goes back to its original position. This is a vast improvement on how it was when I received the loco to repair. After this, I ran the engine for a while and now it's running much more smoothly than it did. This next part of the video deals with something that is absolutely vital and should be checked and adjusted on every model locomotive. Here I'm lifting the centre wheel and you will notice that the other wheels stay on the rolling road. And when I lift the rear wheel, only the rear wheel lifts, the other two remain on the rolling road. I did exactly the same, not only on the front wheel at this side, which I haven't shown, but all the wheels at the other side. The result was the same, the suspension is balanced. If you look carefully now, when the engine is running, the brake blocks, as shown close up in this front view, are in the right position. Originally, all of the axle boxes were running far too high, and if you have a look at an earlier episode in this series, you can see this clearly. In this clip, I'm putting firm downward pressure on the engine to simulate it being full of water. It still appears to run okay, but I will have to check this with the boiler and tanks completely full of water. And after filling the engine and boiler right to the top with water, I will have to adjust the suspension to make sure it sits level on the track. Running the engine full of water will probably make a mess of my workbench. So I'll do that in the next episode. That is it for this one. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thanks for watching and I hope you found it useful. Please take the time to visit my Mainsteam Models website and click on the section of the website that says Video Playlists. And by doing that, you can find other videos that you may like to watch. And by using the playlists, you can actually watch the videos back to back.